We South Africans are resilient people. We endure the worst, and we have indeed in the past endured the worst excesses of a dark past, and we were able to emerge, but we emerged united and strong. The virtues of courage, of optimism, and of compassion carried us along the path to freedom, and they are what has sustained us in the past and will continue to sustain us. As we recall and recount the life of Christ on Good Friday, we also remember the greatest virtue of all, and that is the virtue of sacrifice. Despite the heavy burden that has been placed on our people over the past 2 weeks, we have understood that for greater good, these sacrifices have to be made. Our people have endured the extreme restrictions on their daily lives with patience and fortitude. As Christians, the belief that Christ gave his life as a ransom for humankind is the most fundamental tenet of faith. Today, many Christians around the world recite the way of the cross, remembering the pain Christ suffered. This meditation on deprivation and adversity is a reminder that throughout history, as they face daily life, every human being upon this earth has had their own cross to bear. The coronavirus pandemic is a heavy cross being carried on the shoulders of all of humankind at the moment. Rich and poor, young and old, black and white, men and women are suffering under its weight in one form or another. But the message of Easter is also one of hope, of recovery, of triumph, and of rebirth. We have the utmost confidence that the measures we've taken of declaring a national state of disaster and of imposing a lockdown have been correct and absolutely necessary.
Various political parties have welcomed and noted President Cyril Ramaphosa's decision to extend the nationwide lockdown for a further 14 days. While most parties acknowledge the massive impact this will have on the economy, they say the decision that informs the end of the lockdown must be determined by scientific data. The president further announced a three-step strategy to save the economy from collapsing and to prevent the loss of life. These include intensifying the public health response and increasing social support to protect the poor and vulnerable households.
The National Coronavirus Command Council has decided to extend the nationwide lockdown by a further 2 weeks beyond the initial 21 days. This means that most of the existing lockdown measures will remain in force until the end of April.
The country will be under lockdown for 2 more weeks. The decision was made to stop the spread of the coronavirus, which has already claimed the lives of 24 South Africans. The extension will have a dire impact on the country's ailing economy. Political parties have welcomed the president's decision, but have asked government to introduce measures that will mitigate the pressure on the poorest of the poor.
The extension of 2 more weeks of lockdown is a time for us to focus on our hopes and not our fears, and work with each other to unite in this period of crisis, to bring about a complete and absolute saving of lives of people is a great, great task that we all must face.
In the meantime, however, there are a number of steps government could take in dealing with the current lockdown and making sure that it gets credibility and buy-in from the people of South Africa. The first of these is a massive reworking of the essential goods item. It simply makes no sense that shops have got goods on their shelves that customers cannot buy.
We call on all government to impose an interest-free payment holiday for 3 months for all people who cannot afford to make the monthly payments due to the lockdown. The President and COVID-19 Command Council are tiptoeing around the financial services sector and are afraid to provide decisive and clear direction.
Any aid or any funds putting available to assist businesses cannot be based on black economic empowerment. It must be on an equal basis to all people in South Africa.
The President and his executive will take a pay cut off their salaries for 3 months and donate it to the Solidarity Fund. The EFF has also followed suit, as well as Ekurhuleni Mayor Mzwandile Masina and his executive. Natasha Phiri, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, more from that address from the President last night, we'll be speaking to Angelo Fick, a Research Director at ASRI. Good evening, Angelo, and welcome to The Full View. Listening into what the President had to say last night and how he ended his speech, I wonder whether that speech hit the right notes, considering that the President also saying that much is being asked of you, far more than should ever be asked.
Right, so I have a fairly positive evaluation of what the President's speech was about, despite my criticisms of where I think there are gaps. I think it was a timely speech. It announced the extension a week before so that it gave people some time to get adjusted to it and wasn't visited upon them the night before the original expiration next week, Thursday. So in general terms, I think the President acquitted himself well. I think on the specifics, there are some very serious questions that the Ramaphosa government as a whole has to answer about the ordinary people of South Africa, some of which has been raised by some opposition parties, but also by various players in the NPO and NGO sector and civic organizations across South Africa.
So would you then argue that the three-pronged approach, the three-pronged strategy that the President announced yesterday, which include the intensifying of public health response, comprehensive package of economic support, as well as a program to increase social support to protect the poor and vulnerable household, is not enough?
I think that the three-pronged strategy is enough. I think the detail inside each of those strategies does need to be spelled out a little better for ordinary South Africans, particularly on the last prong. So if you're going to have better social support for ordinary South Africans, that cannot simply include the UIF measures that are geared at people who used to be employed. There must be greater detail and better planning, I think, at this point, for the millions of people who have been unemployed for a much longer time, do not qualify for unemployment insurance, and therefore are sitting in slight panic, great concern about not only what is going to happen next week or next month, but what's going to happen tonight and what's going to happen tomorrow morning. Children who were dependent on school feeding schemes now have to be taken care of by civic organizations and some parts of government. But that plan is sustainable in the short term. How much longer will that have to happen? And to what extent, and here the President did raise it, will big business have to come to that particular party to link up the second and third prongs of the approach?
Yeah, and just looking, about 5 days ago, there was a letter that was sent to the Department of Social Development, which was acknowledged by the Deputy Minister of Social Development, Deputy Minister Henrietta, and this was from a coalition of various NGOs as well as civil rights organizations, saying that the President or the NCC itself must take into consideration an increase in the social grant, especially for children, considering that what we've noticed since the start of March is that the prices of food items have escalated.
So there are two components to that issue. The first is that, of course, if children are now home, the kind of meals that they could have gotten at schools through school feeding schemes, however inadequate those would have been, are no longer there. And so the child grant will now have to take care of more meals than it used to. Secondly, in terms of the second issue, which is around the provision of the increase in prices, that's an issue for the DTIC to take care of, and greater monitoring. And this, of course, is where state capacity is very crucial, Because it's one thing to have legislation, but you need to have a retinue of inspectors and observers who can actually enforce the laws and policies that are passed. And here it is now up to ordinary South Africans to start complaining about specific price increases in specific locations, and for government to react to that swiftly and promptly. But businesses cannot take this as an opportunity to inflate prices. And this is not only about spaza shops. This happens also in supermarket chains. We've all had the experience of walking into well-known supermarket chains and seeing things that cost X, a week ago, suddenly costing X plus 1 or sometimes X multiplied by 2. And, supermarket chains, are chains, the officials are calling this the response to supplier increases. But this needs much more careful monitoring and actually regulation by government.
Yeah.
And that, I think, might be tough under the circumstances, but absolutely necessary.
And also extending that ability to monitor to companies themselves and those who may use this opportunity to try and retrench workers.
Right, so we must remember this is a country in which the wage inequality is among the greatest on the planet, and alongside that, a great wealth inequality. Let's not forget that just last decade, there was a moment in which the lowest paid employee in a particular supermarket chain would have had to work for hundreds of years to earn what the chief operating officer earned at the time, which was a bonus of 660 million rand for a year's work. That replicates itself in various ways across various companies. And often what is happening now, or what there is an opportunity for people to do now, is to satisfy the shareholders of businesses by applying for government bailouts, paying those people and still laying off workers, and then requiring those workers to go onto UIF. We've seen an example of this in the United Kingdom. It is going to be absolutely essential for the South African government to prevent this from happening so that businesses do not, in fact, get a double dip at the tax revenue by, one, having themselves bailed out, laying off workers and putting them on unemployment insurance instead of taking the bailout money to ensure that the workers are sustained. That will have to be very carefully monitored, not just by government, but by all of the trade unions and federations and by labour observers, because this is not a moment in which people can profiteer off the crisis or of the suffering of the people as a result of the crisis.
Finally, what we've seen around the globe as well is that, especially when it comes to banks responding with the payment holidays for their customers, but we haven't seen a unified response from the banks themselves in terms of how they will be assisting their customers, including a payment freeze. Is this something that we should have been expecting from the president or being announced by the president, considering that the Reserve Bank has also stepped in?
I think we shouldn't expect everything to come from the president. This is also a moment in which I think the South African journalist cadre needs to get out there and actually start investigating the difference between a payment holiday and clients who have bank accounts and actually have credit and debit repayment insurance. And so that kind of consumer information must be made available to the ordinary public. It is the responsibility of banks to do so, but it is also the responsibility of all of us who have that information to continue to reiterate that information at appropriate points. We cannot expect that the president or the council itself should at every moment give us every detail of every piece of information. That information should certainly be published, when necessary gazetted, but it is the duty of everybody who is in control of or has some control or measure of control over information peddling to make sure that the right information gets out there. This echoes what we've just heard from the World Health Organization, that we have to have appropriate, proper, good information out there.
But the argument from some is that it's not only about those people who have insurance, who have their debt insured, but those who also don't have their debt insured. And for instance, what do we say about municipalities themselves in terms of cutting rates and taxes during this period, especially those who have, for households, who have people renting out their back rooms?
So that's a much more complicated scenario that you're asking about, because to begin with, if we simply give a repayment holiday to everybody, regardless of the details, we're missing out on the fact that many people will have paid money every year in to get their credit and debit insurance. So we should make a separation of different kinds of clients in relation to banks. Those who don't have them should certainly be counselled into and given those kinds of debt holidays. When we're talking about municipalities, the scene is much more complicated, because if you give a blanket sort of debt holiday to people, you are going to have service interruptions because, again, the president indicated that suppliers must be paid.
Yeah.
If you want water running, you can't simply now decide that there's going to be no payment for anybody in any structure whatsoever. The constitutional equality rights that exist, and so the legal domain in which you're going to articulate these kinds of debt holidays have to be carefully considered so that it does in fact benefit everybody and doesn't just become a scene in which we do gestures of largesse that in the medium term might look good, in the longer term actually is detrimental to all of us. And in this crisis, I think it's very easy for all of us to come up with quick solutions, but not think through the problem to its logical end. And here I think it is important to rely on experts, and I'm certainly not an expert in municipal debt restructuring, but I think it is important to rely on such people and listen to what they say before we simply have politically popular solutions that could give us much more politically complicated problems that will make the COVID-19 crisis even more, sort of severe.
Well, thank you so much for that. Angelo Fick, Research Director at ASRI.